There is a particular kind of silence that follows the sentence you swore you would never say. Not shock exactly, recognition. You hear it leave your mouth in the same tone, the same rhythm, coming from the same place as the person you spent years deciding you would never become. Maybe it happens in a doorway, maybe over the phone, maybe in the middle of an argument that started about something else entirely. The setting rarely matters. What matters is the half-second gap between saying it and hearing yourself say it, the gap where recognition lives. And in that gap, before you can explain it away, you know exactly what just happened. You didn't slip, you arrived. This isn't mainly a story about deliberate hypocrisy. Hypocrisy can explain some contradictions, but it does not fully explain cases in which a person's commitment was sincere, and later behavior begins to violate the value they still consciously hold. It's about something stranger and more uncomfortable, people who meant what they said, built a life around it, and then found themselves acting in ways that resembled what they had spent years rejecting. The parent who swore they'd never control their children the way they were controlled and became more rigid than the parent they feared. The peacekeeper who built an entire identity around never raising their voice until the day they did, all at once, with a force that frightened everyone in the room, including themselves. The independent one, the self-sufficient one, the person who needed no one, quietly, over years, alone. The disciplined one, the one who never let themselves slip, who built an entire self out of control until the control itself gave way all at once, and what came after looked nothing like discipline at all. In these examples, the reversal is not being explained as a conscious change of mind, and it does not prove that the original value was false. The person's stated commitment may remain sincere even while their behavior begins to contradict it. That tension, a consciously held value producing conduct that resembles its opposite, is the pattern this video is examining. Carl Jung had a word for this. He called it Enantiodromia, an ancient Greek term he used for the emergence of an unconscious opposite over time. In psychological types, Jung associated the term with Heraclitus's play of opposites, life and death, waking and sleep, the way up and the way down. Jung brought that ancient pattern into his account of the individual psyche. The move was part of a larger question running through his work. Not whether opposites exist inside a person, but what happens to the relationship between them when one side is granted all the attention and the other is granted none. In his account, a psychological position, a value, an identity, a discipline held with enough rigidity over enough time doesn't simply persist unchanged. It generates pressure. And that pressure doesn't build against the position from some outside source. It builds from what the position has been excluding the entire time it was being held. Here's the part that's easy to misunderstand and worth being careful about. This isn't a claim that every strong belief eventually collapses, or that discipline is secretly dangerous, or that anyone who commits fully to a value is destined to betray it. Jung was not describing a universal law established through modern experimental science. In his formal definition, he presented Enantiodromia as a characteristic psychological phenomenon associated with extreme one-sidedness. This video treats it as an interpretive tendency under certain conditions, not a guarantee for everyone who holds a conviction. Within this model, the conditions surrounding the conviction also matter. Two people can hold the same conviction with the same intensity and arrive at entirely different places depending on what they did with everything that conviction asked them to set aside. It isn't the value that creates the risk. It's what gets done with everything the value requires a person to set aside. The risk lives less in the position itself than in the gap between what a person consciously allows and what they've quietly decided has no place in who they are. Jung connected Enantiodromia to his broader idea of compensation, the proposal that a strongly one-sided conscious attitude may be accompanied by opposing tendencies outside awareness. Within that model, Enantiodromia can be understood as one possible form of compensation when excluded material has received little conscious acknowledgement and appears abruptly rather than gradually. That does not make every contradiction an instance of Enantiodromia, and it does not establish that suppression mechanically produces reversal. It offers a way of interpreting some reversals in which the disowned side of a position appears to shape behavior. A person who allows some ongoing contact with what they're excluding may experience that tension as friction, an occasional pull, a nagging doubt, a small opposing voice that's uncomfortable but survivable. A person who seals the excluded material off entirely may, in some cases, experience it later as something closer to rupture. The examples that follow are illustrations of that interpretation, not diagnoses and not a checklist to run against your own life. They describe recognizable situations rather than universal outcomes. What they share is a specific condition, a value maintained by shutting something out entirely rather than by holding it alongside whatever it excludes. None of them is offered as proof that this is happening to you specifically. They're offered as a way of naming the pattern clearly enough to notice it, if it happens to be present. Picture the parent who was raised by someone controlling, someone who monitored, restricted, second-guessed every decision, until independence felt like the only thing worth wanting in the world. That parent builds their entire adult identity in opposition to that experience. Permissiveness becomes a kind of proof. Proof that they are not that person. Proof that love doesn't have to look like control. Every rule they choose not to enforce, every boundary they leave undrawn, becomes further evidence, at least to them, that the old pattern has been broken for good. For years, it works. Their children have room to breathe, room their own childhood never gave them. And then, somewhere around adolescence, something the parent can't quite name starts to surface. A fear they never let themselves feel, because feeling it would have meant admitting that maybe control isn't only cruelty, that sometimes it's also protection, structure, the thing that keeps a child from a real and specific harm. That fear was never resolved. It was avoided, pushed to the side every time it appeared, treated as an intruder rather than information. And avoided fear may return in less manageable forms. One day, the same parent who built their identity on freedom is standing in a doorway, issuing rules with a rigidity that would have embarrassed them a decade earlier. The model would not describe this simply as hypocrisy. It would ask whether the rejected need for structure has returned in an unintegrated form, or picture the version that runs through conflict instead of control. Someone learns early that anger is dangerous. Maybe it was dangerous in the house they grew up in. Maybe it cost them something once, and they decided, privately, never again. So they build a self around avoidance. They become the reasonable one, the mediator, the person who can sit in a room full of tension and stay calm when no one else can. This isn't fake. It's a genuine skill, useful and admirable, and for a long time it serves them well. People come to rely on them for exactly this, the steadiness that lets a room stay level when everyone else has lost their footing. But every disagreement they smooth over instead of naming, every resentment they absorb instead of voicing, doesn't disappear simply because it went unspoken. It can remain outside conscious attention and influence how later disagreements are experienced. In this example, when the unspoken resentment is eventually expressed, it emerges not as a calm, mediated conversation, but as the explosion the whole identity was built to prevent. The peacekeeper becomes, for one terrifying evening, the very thing peace was supposed to protect everyone from. There's a version built around independence too, and this one is quieter, which makes it easier to miss until it's already happened. Someone decides, often for good reason, that needing other people is a liability. Maybe they were let down at a moment that mattered. maybe dependence, for them once meant vulnerability, and vulnerability once meant getting hurt in a way they never forgot. So they build a self that doesn't need anyone, competent, self-contained, admirable even, to everyone watching from outside. It draws real respect. People describe them as strong, as low maintenance, as someone who has their life together in a way few others seem to. And it works for a while, in the way that armor works, but the part of them that wanted closeness didn't get resolved when it got overruled. It got shelved. And a shelved need may continue shaping behavior even when it is not consciously acknowledged. Years later, the same self-sufficiency that once felt like strength has quietly narrowed into something that looks a great deal like isolation, not chosen in any single moment, but arrived at one small refusal of connection at a time, until the independence that was supposed to protect them from ever needing anyone has left them needing everyone and reaching for no one. Devotion has its own version of this, and it may be the hardest one to watch because it doesn't look like reversal at first. It looks like patience. Someone commits themselves completely to another person, a partner, a cause, a role, and for a long stretch, that commitment is exactly what it appears to be: generous, sincere, whole. Everyone around them can see it and says so, which only makes the commitment feel more confirmed, more clearly the right way to love someone. But total devotion to anything usually requires setting something aside, a need, an ambition, a part of the self that simply doesn't fit inside the shape devotion asks them to take. If that part is acknowledged, grieved, and given some place within the relationship, the devotion no longer has to depend on pretending that the sacrifice never mattered. If that part is simply excluded, it may return indirectly, sometimes through scorekeeping and resentment. The same devotion that once looked like love can begin using the language of sacrifice and loyalty as a weapon instead of a gift. Discipline carries its own risk, and this one is often the most disorienting because discipline is usually treated as the safest, most stable of all these positions. Someone builds an identity around control of appetite, of impulse, of time, of the self, in every visible respect. And for a long time, this looks like strength because in many ways it is strength. Other people ask how they do it. They don't entirely know how to answer because from the inside it rarely feels like effort. It feels like identity. But total control of the self also requires excluding something. The part that wants rest, the part that wants excess, the part that simply wants without justification. If that part is never given any acknowledged place, it may reappear during exhaustion or reduced control, sometimes as excess rather than a small adjustment. The same rigor that built the structure suddenly nowhere to be found, replaced by something closer to the excess the discipline was built to prevent. The most controlled person in the room becomes, for a stretch of time, the least controlled, and the whiplash is often as confusing to them as it is to everyone watching. And moral certainty carries its own risk, maybe the most uncomfortable one of all, because it feels the least likely to apply to the person holding it. Someone builds their identity around opposing a specific cruelty they witnessed or suffered or simply refused to tolerate in any form. This is not a small thing, and it isn't being dismissed here. Moral clarity held honestly is one of the more admirable positions a person can take. People are drawn to that clarity, especially in moments when everyone else around them seems to be equivocating or looking away. But certainty that isn't allowed any doubt starts to require something specific of the person holding it: total confidence, total righteousness, zero tolerance for the possibility that they too could be capable of what they're condemning. That refusal to entertain the possibility doesn't make the possibility disappear. It just makes it unsupervised, and a disowned capacity may become harder to recognize and regulate under pressure. The person who has spent years opposing a specific harm in an unguarded moment sometimes reproduces a version of the exact behavior they built their identity around rejecting. not because their values were fake, but because certainty left no room to notice the same capacity quietly present in themselves the entire time. What connects these examples is not a rule that every trait becomes its opposite. They illustrate one interpretation. When a value is maintained partly by excluding needs, affects, or capacities that remain psychologically relevant, those excluded elements may later influence behavior in indirect or disruptive ways. Within Jung's model, reversal is one possible outcome of severe one-sidedness, not an automatic tax on commitment, and not the only explanation for contradiction. Before an abrupt reversal, people may notice smaller tensions, irritability that seems disproportionate, a private fascination with what they oppose, or a rigidity that keeps tightening rather than settling. None of these, alone or together, proves that a reversal is approaching. They can, however, serve as prompts for reflection. What is this position requiring me not to feel, need, doubt, or admit? The useful response is not stronger willpower, but greater curiosity about what the conscious identity is leaving out. This is where the model becomes genuinely disturbing. Even admirable traits are not automatically protected from distortion. What may matter is not only how strongly a value is held, but whether the person can remain conscious of the needs, affects, and capacities that value tends to push aside. A rigid position may reduce the number of small corrections available before behavior changes abruptly. Within this model, rigidity can increase the risk of reversal. It does not guarantee one. It would be easy to hear all of this as a simple case for moderation. Don't take anything too far, but that flattens the model. Strong commitment can coexist with ongoing contact with what the commitment does not fully contain. The issue is not dosage alone. It is whether fear, need, doubt, appetite, anger, or grief can be acknowledged and given some deliberate form of expression, or whether they are treated as though they must disappear. There's an old, uncomfortable idea buried inside this. Wholeness is not the same as purity. A person who can acknowledge the anger inside patience, the need inside independence, or the doubt inside certainty is not necessarily weaker for it. Within this model, that acknowledgement may make the opposing quality easier to recognize and regulate when it appears. Refusing the opposite entirely may leave the person less prepared when circumstances bring it forward. None of this means the answer is moral relaxation, that discipline should loosen, that boundaries should soften, that conviction should hedge itself into nothing just to be safe. That's not what integration means here, and it would be its own kind of distortion. It means noticing, honestly, what a given commitment is actually asking a person to set aside, and finding some way to acknowledge that cost at the same time as holding the commitment, instead of pretending the cost isn't there. The peacekeeper doesn't need to become volatile. They need an honest way to name the disagreement they're currently swallowing instead of relying on silence to resolve it. The independent one doesn't need to abandon self-sufficiency. They need to notice the need they've been treating as a weakness and examine how it may already be shaping their choices outside awareness. The parent who values freedom doesn't need to become permissive without any limit at all. They need to make peace with the fact that some structure isn't the enemy they once decided it was. This is a harder task than simply committing to a value and defending it without complication. It asks a person to hold the position and what it excludes at the same time, instead of banishing one so the other can feel clean. Choosing a side often feels like integrity, while holding contradiction can feel like weakness or confusion. But within Jung's model, the clean, undivided position may be the one building pressure out of sight. A more self-aware position, one willing to hold tension without immediately exporting it, may be more stable over time. So the next time you hear yourself say the sentence you swore you'd never say, in the same tone, the same rhythm, coming from the place you thought you'd sealed off years ago, it may not prove that your values were false or that you were destined to become their opposite, it may be a sign that something those values excluded has begun shaping the moment. The question is not whether the opposite was always going to return. It is whether you can notice the tension early enough to choose how it is expressed before circumstance chooses for you.